So, good afternoon to all of you, or good afternoon to the participant. Good afternoon, Sofia. We are again at the webinar on theories of regulation and governance, and it's my pleasure today to host Sofia Ranchordas. She's a full professor of EU and comparative public law at the University of Groningen, and she's also professor of law and innovation and sustainability at LUIS in Rome. Thank you very much, Sofia, and I invite you to present your paper or talk about regulatory innovation, future-proofing, and experimental regulation. All this in the case of artificial intelligence regulation. So it's our pleasure to have you, Sofia, and thank you very much for joining us today. Please go on.
Thank you very much, David, for inviting me, and thanks to all the participants. I will share my screen. So my talk will focus on the complex interaction between regulation and innovation, and how experimental approaches to this topic can actually be used to ensure that law can have a facilitative role in the process of innovation. In a way, it engages with the literature that has been quite positive about the relationship between regulation and innovation, but it also takes into account the criticism that has been made to this body of literature. In a way, it has, the goal of my scholarship, so far has been to try to find a way to actually design anticipatory regulation, experimental regulation that promotes evidence-based perspectives to the regulation of innovation, and that assumes that it is possible for regulatory instruments to actually play a more active, more facilitative role in the innovation process. So in that sense, it is not like a blind, acceptance of the idea that we as lawyers or we as regulators can stimulate innovation, and that innovation is always good. I think that's a very naive perspective, of course. Responsible innovation is good, ethical innovation is good, sustainable innovation is good, but I think that it is important to actually look at this with greater nuance. So basically, in my talk, I will focus more specifically on experimental instruments, namely regulatory sandboxes, because they were actually, along with other measures, proposed now in the AI regulation proposal or the Artificial Intelligence Act. So hence the focus on this specific piece of legislation. So one of the issues that I will address as well is, of course, that part of the skepticism that has been put forward regarding this idea of experimenting with law or designing future-proof regulation has to do with the design and methodological shortcomings that experiments may have, and they do have indeed these shortcomings. So at the end of the talk, I will leave a couple of guidelines which are based on a paper that will be published very soon, where I actually delve into the methodology of experiments and how they actually can, be designed in order to comply with principles of good science and principles of good regulation. So I think it was well known that technology as such requires regulators to make a number of complex decisions, whether and when to intervene, what kind of regulatory intervention to employ, what stakeholders to involve in the regulatory process, and also how long the regulatory intervention should last. And this timing issue hasn't really deserved a great deal of attention. There have been some political science and legal scholars in the US and Canada that have written about the timing elements. But I would say that, in Europe especially, there hasn't been quite a lot of attention to the timing elements, which is, in my opinion, quite a pity, because the timing element is one of the key issues in the innovation process. So in that sense, it could be important to also focus a little bit more on this aspect. And as we know, regulators are responsible not only for the promotion of the public or private interest, depending on the theories that you take into account, but they are mainly here responsible for the social embedding of new technologies, and for the management between the economic and social benefits of innovation and risks that are associated with the implementation of technology. And I think in the past years, past decades, I would say, regulation and governance has suffered, has undergone a big turn towards risk regulation. And risk has indeed been become this perspective that has been used for decades to measure the need for regulation, to gauge its potential impact, and to time the intervention that is required. I'm not going to focus on risk regulation as such, but rather on the instruments that actually can be used to improve the process of regulating technology. I just will assume that the risk is that, of course, in the case of AI, the AII Act actually proposes a number of instruments that should be actually put forward. So the risk, this risk thinking is already underlying many of the new legislative proposals that we actually have seen in the last years. However, despite this different, this alignment of ideas that we actually that are well known in theories of regulation and in scholarship that emerged in the last decades, what we have seen is that regulators have kept muddling through evidence and have followed still incrementalist approaches to the regulation of technology. So it still remains rather unclear how regulation and innovations should interact. And it's actually only, I would say, in the last decade that we have seen more consistent and systematic work on the regulation and innovation, also work that is not just presenting a naive perspective of private innovators, but work that really takes into account different perspectives. And I mean, the names that I have here on this sheet are well known to all of you, but I would reinforce that it's probably primarily thanks to the work of economists and political scientists like Mazzucato, Susanna Boras, Charles Edquist, but also like lawyers like Chrissy Ford and Lyria Bennett Moses, that this field of research has actually been advanced. And it is good to see that many of the young scholars working on regulation of innovation now actually put forward or try to implement many of the ideas that were developed in this scholarship. And this group of scholars has actually tried to show that there is a role to be played by the state, by regulation, and also that this role is not limited to being a passive controller of risk, which is still something that we actually see in other pieces of regulation. And in the AI proposal, we actually see that the regulation that is suggested is not only meant to control risk, but there's also this idea that there should be a regulation as well that can promote innovation. So we see that we are already shifting from this traditional, control of risk to actually, implement the idea that the state can actually facilitate and advance regulation also by using anticipatory regulation. Of course, in practice, this so-called innovation-friendly measures haven't always been designed in the most scientific way, and there has been quite a lot of critique to the so-called innovation principles and innovation-friendly measures at EU level. And I think most of you also are aware of this critique that has been partially connected to the fact that the innovation principle was pushed forward by the industry, by the biochemical industry, and many regard as a bit of an enemy to the precautionary principle. I believe it's more. We have to wait and see. I don't think this principle has yet acquired the role of a legal principle, but it has already gained its place. For example, in the EU better regulation toolbox. So only the feature will tell how we actually use it and define it. But I do think it's important for regulation and governance scholars to also take into account this this principle as something that can have a serious dimension, because when we look at the scholarship that I just mentioned before, this scholarship also tries to analyze the role of innovation in a sense. So this is innovation principle can indeed be only a proposition from the industry, but when fleshed out by scholars, I think it could have less radical meaning, and it could actually have, be a pillar for further studies on the regulation of innovation. And the same is valid for the so-called innovation-friendly measures. So this innovation-friendly measures, and this turn to actually adopt innovation-friendly measures has been visible in multiple documents from the European Union. And what we see is that there is this attempt to actually use timing measures and experimental measures to actually promote innovation. So in this sense, we see this, this idea that we need to actually make sure we shift our regulatory perceptions from, being more focused on reactions to risks or reactions to problems, to actually anticipating them and trying to see how we can facilitate innovation through new mechanisms. So, while a few decades ago there was, more the question whether there should be a regulatory conversation about the topic of innovation and how to define innovation for regulatory and policy purposes, I think that nowadays we should assume that this conversation is important and ask ourselves not only who should carry the conversation. I think this has been answered already by much of the scholarship, but also when to carry the conversation and how to actually introduce instruments from a very critical perspective that can help us advance the innovation process, but while keeping in mind all the different possible side effects that economic innovation can have. So my talk actually, the remaining minutes of my talk aim to offer more questions regarding this aspect than answers. But I think the focus here is also not only on the role of innovation as such, but also how regulation can promote the advancement of innovation that is responsible, ethical, and sustainable. And I see that this is, the AI proposal is perhaps at first sight not the best example, because the regulatory sandboxes that actually emerge more like at the end of the proposal, they are not sufficiently fleshed out at the moment. So many think that they actually create some space for many derogations. But the truth is that they don't create space for the derogation from important legislation like the GDPR. The idea of the sandboxes is not to allow for everything, but actually to allow for responsible innovation in a way. And of course, there's still quite a lot of room to explore how this will take place in practice. But there are a few aspects that I think we should already consider. So we see actually that the AI regulation proposal is a very timely illustration of the regulatory conversation between regulation and innovation, especially because of the many measures that are proposed. So basically what we see is that the impact assessment that is actually proposed, that it was made actually for this proposal, already actually emphasized the need to actually develop ethical and trustworthy AI. So in that sense, the perspective of innovation that underlies this proposal is already one that is not only focused on pure economic innovation, but actually on the social dynamics of innovation. Another aspect that is important, of course, is how this innovation has should be stimulated by the measures that are implemented or proposed in these regulation. And here we have mainly sandboxes and then so-called other measures that aim to reduce regulatory burdens. I'm not going to focus so much on the other measures, also because they are quite well connected to regulatory sandbox, and because they might also, they also not defined in very specific terms. But the regulatory sandboxes are important for different reasons. So the first aspect is that we see that sandboxes are leaving now sector-specific contexts and actually moving into more general areas. So far, we have seen sandboxes mostly in Fintech, for example, so in the financial sector, but also in healthcare, energy and telecoms in more recent years. And now this idea of creating sandboxes, which are more general, to promote innovation on AI is actually an interesting shift from the sector-specific conditions to more general ones. it is still very difficult to actually know how AI regulatory sandboxes will be operationalized. And at the first sight, we actually would say the proposal allows for regulatory experiments at member state level, which can sound quite appealing because this could allow indeed for the promotion of innovation in AI at local or state level. And it fits within existing trends to advance, flexible and future-proof regulation. But at the same time, there are still many questions because this idea of actually experimenting with regulation by derogating from certain rules has to be extremely well defined. And this is something that we still don't see. What we see is a paradigm shift from this reactive regulation to anticipatory regulation, which actually gives rise to some concerns that I would like to explore with you in the last minutes of my talk. So when we actually design anticipatory regulation, I mean, it has been implicit to my talk so far that I do consider regulatory sandboxes to be a way of designing anticipatory regulation. We need to consider a number of aspects. So the adoption of regulatory sandboxes introduces, an element of, experiment, of course, which has been, disregarded with some, I would say it has been regarded with some skepticism, because there's always this idea of gathering evidence. But this is the case because there is this perception that it is possible to gather evidence to promote learning and learning by doing, but also to promote the idea of outcomes-based regulation. And experiments have been closely connected to the innovation process. So in that sense, this is something that seems obvious to someone who is an innovation scholar, but for regulation scholars, this is not obvious at all because it really shifts the way in which we regulate, or we have been regulating for a while, and it goes a little bit further than the concept of responsive regulation, which has, of course, been very helpful in offering a framework for escalating forms of government intervention and making sure that regulation remains updated. So this idea of sandboxing is anticipatory because it actually already tries out new forms of regulation that can be interesting for the future, but they also shake quite a lot of pillars, especially of law. And one of the issues that I find quite worrying is that this hasn't been totally analyzed in this context. So we talk about anticipatory regulation, governance, sandboxing, but very often it's forgotten that we have been experimenting with law and regulations for many centuries even. So these regulatory sandboxes they are maybe new in regulation, but the experimental approach has existed in specific sectors, and especially has existed in the context of decentralization and federalism. And what we have seen in this tradition of experiments that have been adopted in different countries, especially in France, Germany, but also the former British Empire, is that experiments suffer from a number of deficiencies. So very often they are not transparent. They don't have the way in which they are designed leads to disproportionate outcomes. And most importantly, they actually are affected by a number of methodological problems. So when we look at the design and methodological issues of experiments, and this affects and will affect regulatory sandboxes if we don't design regulatory sandboxes properly from the very beginning, what we see is that there is a risk that experiments will actually be deficient in their internal and external validity. And this has been a critique that has been advanced, for example, in France, to the many experimental laws that have been adopted in the last decades. In many cases, it is impossible to actually draw any causal inferences because, of course, an experiment in real life is never an experiment in a lab, or a field experiment. But still, there are very often no safeguards to make sure that the policy advisors behind the experiment can really assert what the causes and results were. And also another aspect that has been also has been advanced as a possible critique to sandboxing is that very often these experiments are done in a very small cohorts, and then it is almost impossible to generalize the results. And so these problems of internal external validity are something that have characterized experimental legal regimes for many years. And as we shift in regulation and governance to this model of anticipating rules and anticipating regulation and welcoming experimental approaches to regulation, I think it's important to also think of the design of experiments and also think of ways in which we can improve the internal and external validity of experiments, because this is something that is crucial if we want to advance this perspective. And this is something that we don't need to reinvent the wheel for this. The principles of good science and principles of good regulation are, in this case, very helpful to help us redesign, this, framework. Because basically, when we look at, the key principles of good experiments, we already see that, the need for clearly formulated experiments and clearly formulated hypotheses with achievable questions, proportionate implementation, random assignment policy. These are key ideas that we already have, that we already can build upon. And the quest for further rationalization and objectivity should actually start from there. So in a way, the idea is that if we want to achieve evidence-based regulation for innovation, I think we have to start with the redesign of experiments, because this is something that we don't see actually very clearly in the AI regulation proposal. I don't think it has been totally thought through, but if we want to have regulatory sandboxes that truly promote innovation, that really help us understand how the innovation process works, we actually need to start by designing a framework that, on the one hand, has principles of good regulation, good science, but on the other also allows for enough flexibility to ensure that experiments can take place and can assist innovators, especially small and medium enterprises, with their quest for experiments. So to conclude, I think we all know, especially those who are in the field of regulation and governance, I think we are all very well acquainted with the different phases and different trends of regulation from the past decades. And maybe this is one that actually will pass at some point. But experiments have existed for centuries. In a way, they didn't exist in regulation and governance. They existed mostly in constitutional law and local law. So it's not totally surprising that we now actually welcome them in regulation. But of course, their success and their future depends very much on how we design them and how we ensure that they are used to produce sound evidence, and that they are used actually not to just promote innovation as such, but actually to promote responsible and ethical innovation. So I personally really enjoyed reading Christie's fourth book on innovation in the States, because I think her perspective, although not totally focusing on experiments, really brings into light some of these issues that I have discussed today. And ultimately, it's about ensuring that experimental regulation and the anticipatory view of regulation actually still is designed to ensure that there is sufficient transparency and public accountability when implementing sandboxes and other so-called innovation-friendly measures. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Sofia. Excellent presentation, very clear. And I'm happy to open the floor for questions. We have two in the chat already, but I'd like to ask the Jan to, maybe you want to ask it with your own voice, or shall we read? Jan?
Yeah, sure. I can say it myself, because it is a bit involved. I wanted to create two paragraphs and pressed enter, and as a consequence, it flew in the chat. So it's two questions, hence the one, but the absence of a two. First of all, you mainly talk about, when you talk about experimental regulation, about sandboxes. So these are where you have a regulatory framework and the regulator creates a limited exception in which companies can try out new products, new business models, and they are protected from the full brunt of the regulation in that sandbox. But what about the reverse? What do you think about regulators that introduce experimental rules, so rules that have a limited validity, so that have a sunset clause, and may be stricter or impose new obligations on companies, but where the regulator wants to assess what is the effect of this. Is this going to lead to less investment in innovation or something like that? You mentioned a few things on that, but I'm quite interested to hear if you have anything more to say on that. And then secondly, that was meant to be the second point, your talk focused on the proposal for the AI regulation. What about, I don't know if you have any views also on the proposal for the Digital Markets Act.
Thank you. Thank you, Jan. And Sofia, please.
Thank you. Jan, thank you very much for the question. I actually, I didn't talk about sunset clauses, even though I actually wrote my PhD primarily on sunset clauses. The reason why I avoided temporary regulation, and especially this, so it's kind of experiments that actually are, that in fact they are, just basically sunset, new laws with sunset clauses, is because sunset clauses as such, and these kind of experiments really are an example of an experiment that doesn't give us a control group. You basically apply the same regime to everyone. And it's not really an experiment, it's a temporary regulation. But you don't have at the same time two different groups that allow you to have a comparison. So, I mean, and this is one reason. So it basically has, the methodological problem that you basically experiment now and you compare it to the past. And it has obvious advantages because it is a way of, winning, some political support, for example. It's very difficult sometimes to introduce new regulation, and a temporary regulation always helps in a sense to achieve political compromise, I would say. But at the same time, the history of sunset clauses has been also showed us that sunset clauses are very often renewed without evaluations, and that has been very, very often the case in the US, for example, where especially in the 80s, sunset clauses actually resulted in more bureaucracy and more laws and more inconsistent laws that actually to the termination of laws that were necessary. So I'm a little bit skeptical of this so-called experiment with only sunset clauses, because I'm afraid that if you don't have a framework of evaluation, it's just a sunset. At some point, I'm not sure whether it will really lead to a real experiment, but more of we don't have enough support, so we'll just start with a sunset and then it will get renewed anyway. So that is something that history has proven this, position to be the most common one. And that's what my concern. But I'm happy to engage with this because, I mean, from a historical perspective, it has been very common. Regarding your second question on Digital Market Act. So whether it is future-proof, I don't know, to be honest, whether the Digital Service Act package is actually future-proof. I don't think, I'm not sure. The e-commerce directive lasted very long, but it's not future-proof because it's very obsolete. It's obsolete now, so it really did not resist the ravages of time. I'm not sure whether this will. I think perhaps when it comes to consumer protection, it is future-proof. Because it sets forth principles that might actually not change so very well. But for example, when it comes to specific regulations on, for example, the number of users and the super platforms, I don't know. I'm not sure whether that is a good measure. So I would say that there is an attempt to make it future-proof, especially when it comes to certain topics, but some aspects are also very tightly regulated, and those I think they will probably become obsolete.
Quickly.